away, and half of the stuff your fingers just do on autopilot. I mean, that's what happens after having done one language for several years. And to get that in another language, it takes a fair amount of time. And so it seems kind of a waste to have to climb that curve again and again and again. It would be better to have one language that can span a wider spectrum. And so the more modern languages try to be built so that they can be used both in the small and in the large, so that you don't have to have the need for these mini languages every time. So like Scala, for example, or even a traditional language such as Lisp or Scheme, will have mechanism where you can embed littler languages into the big language. And then that way, let's say, right now I'm working on something. I need to do a lot of drawings for a book, and I'm not going to sit there with Visio and make them all by hand, because I have to make hundreds of them. So I have a mini language that assembles rectangles and arrows and stuff into bigger diagrams. And I figured, what could I do? There are existing languages that kind of do that, and they happen not to quite do what I wanted to. And so, of course, I figured I'd do my own. But I wasn't going to write a new programming language. I'm putting it inside Scala because I know Scala. And that way, all of the stuff that I know about Scala, and how do collections work, how do loops work, how do methods work, how do function calls work, I can use that. I don't have to relearn it in another language. Whereas there's another package where that's in a slightly different level called processing. You may have heard about that. It's something that the people in the art department love to use for like special effects drawings and stuff. And it uses its own little language. And so that seems kind of insane these days. It seems to be much better to have languages that can adapt themselves, that can morph themselves into these domain-specific languages. So we'll be talking about those. So those are kind of the three big themes. So I taught this course last semester in Vietnam, where I was on sabbatical. And before that, someone sent me this book by Bruce Tate called 7 Languages in 7 Weeks. So Bruce was the guy who, the one with the elephant, who wrote that article. And so he's a well-regarded speaker in industry conferences and stuff. Very practical kind of person. And so he said he wrote this book to kind of teach the basics of a whole bunch of different languages to span the spectrum to professional programmers, and one a week. So I looked at that, and I kind of liked the idea. And what I didn't like so much is that he went a lot into syntax. So he had, how do you do loops and stuff in Haskell? How do you do them in Ruby? How do you do them in Scala? It was kind of the same thing over and over again. And I figured, those guys are just industry programmers. Here we have graduate students who, they can recognize a concept once they've seen it once. I don't have to do the same thing over again. So don't get it's a nice book. If you want to get the book, by all means get it. But we're not following it exactly. But I'm kind of following the idea of saying, let's look at a few of the key languages that show different aspects of stuff that one can do nowadays. And so we're going to be digging much more deeply into the mechanisms that make interesting things happen. And we're not really going to be worrying much about basic syntax. And so actually, in the Ruby module, my students last semester, they said, okay, so we had 2 lectures on Ruby, and then we started looking at metaprogramming. In those 2 lectures, when we compared them against the online manual, how come you jumped from chapter 1 to chapter 20? And the reason was that chapter 2 talked about loops, and chapter 3 talked about branches, and chapter 4 talked about functions, chapter 5 talked about arrays and that kind of stuff. And we all know how to do these things. We're just unfamiliar with the Ruby syntax. And so that's just what's going to happen. So you're just going to kind of copy and paste and guess the Ruby syntax for these basic things. But we're going to be really keenly interested in how does it work to make metaprogramming work. And there we're going to be spending more time. So you're not going to be an expert Ruby programmer after 2 weeks. But hopefully you'll be able to kind of speak Pidgin Ruby with the basic things and become a bit of an expert in some of the more advanced features. Because those are the ones that, even though you may never ever do Ruby again, it's very interesting to see how can a programming language be so flexible, how can it be so malleable, what mechanisms go on. And we're going to be using Ruby as an example, because it's easier to see something with an example than just in theory. So most of our focus is not going to be an expert in any of these languages, but to look at what's interesting, what's different about them. And so we're not going to look at how do Ruby do arrays, because other languages do arrays. We know arrays are boring. We're going to be looking at what does Ruby do that no other language does in just that way. The other thing is we're going to do a mixed lecture lab. So you're going to be bringing your laptops for every lecture. I'll be lecturing a little bit less than today, and then there'll be a lab right away. And so that, because when I tell you something and you listen to it and you look at the slides, it all makes so much sense. It always does. And then when you do the first lab assignment and it says, interleave these two arrays, and then you say, holy cow, now what do I do? There was no slide on this. And so that's when you start having to think about it, and that's when you have questions. So we'll do lecture, lab, and then after the lab is over, in the last 10 minutes or so, we have a discussion as to what did it all mean, what did we learn from the lab, that kind of stuff. There is a more or less weekly homework. So one of the things that I always dislike about homework is that I assign some homework project, and some people who should remain unnamed, hopefully none of you, then wait until a day before it's due, and then they say, gosh, isn't there homework due tomorrow? And then they look at it, and then they give me whatever it is that they can figure out in a day. And it's everyone's time is wasted. My time is wasted by giving half-assed comments to a half-assed assignment, and the students' time is wasted because they didn't really learn anything from this. And the way you learn something is by taking a complicated problem and thinking about it day in, day out until the solutions finally come to you. And it's not just usually one thing. It's one thing leads to another, leads to another. And each of those kind of mental breakthroughs takes a day or so. So I'm going to make it so that you have to submit every assignment in a couple of batches. That I want to see, like your first draft and your second draft, sometimes maybe 3 drafts, depending on how the structure is. And I'll give you all we'll just run a version control system, and you just check in what you have. And if I see a steady stream of check-ins, then I'm a happy camper. If I see 0 activity and furious activity the day before, then I'm not. So I'm going to be giving a grade for that there is something there in intermediate form. I don't expect the intermediate form to always work, but I'm going to be looking at how far did people get, what did you have. And that usually leads to better questions in class too, because then we have ample time to answer questions in class. Usually what happens is that the 2 or 3 smart guys who know that you need to work ahead, and hopefully there are more than 2 or 3 smart guys in this room, but they'll answer questions like crazy within a few days after the assignment has been given. But then a whole bunch of the people who could benefit from those questions aren't really paying attention because their brain hasn't been prepared for that. So by forcing you to make more regular submissions, I hope to get past it. And again, maybe it's all of you have great habits already, and in which case it's not going to bother anyone. So there'll be a midterm and a final. Prerequisites are, of course, good programming skills. If you don't feel that you can code, you are not going to enjoy a class in programming languages. Just like, if you don't think that you can solder, you probably shouldn't be in the hardware. I have no idea. I'm not a hardware guy. But so I'm kind of expecting that you have the basic programming skills, that you have had a course in programming languages where you have had some familiarity with the functional programming language. Now, that might have been a few weeks, but hopefully more than a lecture. And that when we do that here at San Jose State, the language can vary actually. Different instructors will choose different languages. So one might choose Scheme and the other might choose Haskell or Scala or something. Like when I teach it, I use Scala, and when Dr. Pierce taught it, I think he used Scheme for the functional part. When Dr. Smith teaches, I think he also uses Scheme, or maybe ML, I don't remember. So people have different preferences, and it doesn't much matter. As long as you can do basic things in a functional language, lists, recursion, then that's good. That's good enough. I just want this not to be the very first time that you've ever seen such a beast. And so I'm checking that in the prerequisite quiz. Doesn't matter what language. JavaScript would be fine. If whatever your instructor taught you functional programming in JavaScript, I'm okay with that. So the grading scheme for whatever. So there's midterm final homework. There's going to be a project. The project's going to be an individual project. I will assign topics. Well, if this many people, there might be groups of 2. And then I'll ask you to give some evidence of participation. There's a discussion group. You'll get some points for asking questions and for answering questions. So I meant to put that on here. Let me pull this up, because this is something that, particularly with if some of you have just recently arrived here. So this is what I told. I'm teaching a course for freshmen, for kids who've never done any programming before. Freshmen, yeah, they don't know what a keyboard is. And so whenever I teach that course for the freshmen, what bugs the heck out of me is that they're stuck, and they don't like it, and so they just do something else. They go and have lunch or something, and they don't ask any questions. And so I have to tell them that it's important to ask questions. And when I taught this course in Vietnam last semester, I had the same problem. Those students, they would never ask any questions. And I would ask them, say, why don't you ask a question? And they said, well, but I don't want to have everyone know that I'm stupid. And that was a reasonable thing to think about 15 years ago, maybe. But nowadays, I cannot imagine doing my job as a researcher, as a book author, as a teacher, without having the entire world know how stupid I am. So what I did here to demonstrate this, I put up a couple of links to some questions that I asked. So here's good old me saying, I want to do this, and I can't figure out how to do it in Scala. The entire world knows that Horstman does not know how to do this in Scala. They know, they laugh. Well, what choice do I have? I don't have the time to figure everything out by myself. I don't have the knowledge to figure out everything by myself. I have to ask questions. And I would imagine when someone finds this 5 years from now, they're not going to hold it against me that 5 years ago I didn't know how to do arcane thing X in Scala. Hopefully they will give me credit that I have grown up since then. But it's there. It's forever. It'll never die. You'll always be able to Google this question and 100 other really stupid questions that I asked. I mean, just like there's so many. Here's another one. Or just as stupid. Please have a look at the following code. I can't figure out why these calls aren't beginning. And it turned out actually that was a better question than I had thought at first, because several other people got the answer wrong. And their wrong answers are now forever memorialized, and anyone can find them. And so there we have in a discussion of where people had, you can read through this. I'll put the link on these slides too, where people had sometimes totally inane answers that a little bit of simple experimentation, which yours truly has of course then done because he was so confused, could disprove. But they put them on there. We had a frank discussion out on the open internet about something. So, and we do that not because we love humiliating ourselves in public, but because we have no choice. What one studies today is so complicated, and there's so much of it, and so much more comes all the time, that if we don't work together and find communities where we help each other, you can't compete. So I have a book, I have a deadline for this book, it has to be out in a few weeks, and I just would not get it done in time if I didn't ask the community for their help and their expertise. When I was coding and need to get stuff done, my boss says, this deadline. If I just say, well, I'm not going to ask a question on a discussion group because otherwise I appear stupid, I mean, it wouldn't have worked. A couple of years ago, I helped out with some mobile phone project, and I knew nothing about the platform. And so I just asked lots of questions, which you can still find on the BlackBerry forum, which mercifully Google doesn't index. But if you log in, you'll see all sorts of silly questions. And so you need to get over the hump if you're not already there, that you ask questions. So you should have gotten an email, those of you who are registered, from this site called Piazza that someone had highly recommended to me as the killer site for student discussions right now. So we're going to give it a try. It was actually done by a graduate student in Stanford, or an undergraduate? Anyway, a student at Stanford who is now trying to turn this into a business. So I thought it was kind of interesting. And she sent me an email a few months ago and said, check it out. And then in the meantime, it's been growing quite nicely. So we'll see whether it's any good. It looks pretty nice. And so when you have a question, ask the question.